um, through our work every day. So community organisations, providing local services, generating local wealth, bringing communities together, and in doing so, they are really tackling some of the really fundamental challenges that we all face. So issues around inequality, local decline, loneliness. But I suppose kind of really what we find is that often they're really kind of doing this on their own steam. This is about determined people kind of making things happen, kind of come what may, really often in spite of kind of local systems and national policy frameworks, rather than being actively supported and encouraged by them. So really, I guess the animating idea behind this new campaign is about, imagine how much more we could achieve if we made it easier for local community action. So that's why we're calling for a Community Power Act as the kind of key plank of this campaign, to really try and make a decisive shift in the balance of power in the country, so people have the power that they need to shape the places that they live. So it's really about resetting the foundations of public policy, so that it's about kind of incubating the solutions which already exist in communities and are already happening, rather than for every kind of new policy idea starting with a blank sheet of paper in Whitehall. So we really think now is the right moment to do this. I think the levelling up agenda is a real opportunity. I think, the power of community has really come to the forefront of our lives over the last 2 years, and we've seen the incredible community response to the pandemic, which has really helped us through this national crisis. So we think now's the time for a Community Power Act. Very happy to talk more about what might be in it, but really want to hand over to Sacha to talk, who's one of the community leaders from the campaign, to talk about the difference this might make in Hartlepool.
Thank you. And can I just interrupt you, Sacha, because I fell down on my chair's duty. I forgot to warn you that the session would be recorded, but I hope that no one objects to that. Please, Sacha, go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm Sacha. I work for a small, hyper-local estate-based community anchor in the Dyke House area of Hartlepool. Back in 2012, I think it was, when everybody realised that the funding had changed and austerity was really beginning to bite. We made a strategic decision as an organisation that, in spite of being told we needed to scale up and become bigger and more geographically focused, what we were going to do was scale deeper. And really, in our square mile of our community where we operate and have operated from at that point for 20 years, we were going to do that. And so what we did was we adopted a community organising approach to our work. And over the last 10 years, that's probably, that supported us and the local community to create the conditions where local people now really take action on the things they care about. And it goes from simple things like organising events, activities for children in the holidays, to planting 25,000 spring flowering bulbs in areas where local authority had abandoned the community. But actually, over that time, it's also moving beyond that. It's much more about, there is a politicisation of that. So, for example, when the local lollipop man was going to get removed, they campaigned to keep him, and were able to articulate and galvanise like a couple of thousand people really quickly. And it was just fantastic to see. They're working with us to create a new community-led housing scheme where we're buying properties, and in our as an organisation, and as part of the social deal with them, with the tenants, is we were asking them to commit to social action. So actually what they're doing is they're working with their neighbours to make their street the best it can be. And by doing that, we're already starting to see that those streets with those houses and those individuals working in that are beginning to show small signs of improvement. It's in its early days, but it's getting there. And we're now running a campaign, because one of the things they kept talking about was how academies are excluding children from school willy-nilly. And so we're now running a campaign around how to challenge that process. And as part of that, we are, 3 or 4 of them want their story shared with the DFE consultation process. So what started off as doing really small-scale stuff about where people live has progressed increasingly into trying to change the conditions in which the systems in which they live. And that's partly where the problem is, because the moment you start challenging that power, whether it's a super local power such as a combined authority or a local authority or the NHS locally, we come up against institutional inertia and institutional barriers. This building that I'm in now, we have been in it for 30 years, and we went for an asset transfer policy. And the policy was so complicated, we ended up just buying the building. It was easier just to go out and get funding to buy a building, which is nonsense when we've been in it for 30 years. We had been working with the Centre for Local Economic Strategy for the last 5 years around community wealth building. We've introduced them to our community, like our institutional anchors, and nobody is prepared to take it up and run with it so that we could create community wealth building in this area. And then I think probably most insidious, and probably lots of people on this call will know that, is when a really effective piece of work takes place in a community, the statutory sector then aims to replicate it and actually then go in direct competition. So we're buying houses in the same place as the council buying houses, and it makes no sense on a local level. You know, the community cafe that was established and chatty tables and so on. And the council then try and replicate that model without any idea of how it's done, as opposed to we're just going to do it because it looks like it's working. And I think a local authority has the convening power and leadership responsibility, which other local agencies follows. And as soon as a barrier is formed by a local authority, the others can fall into line on that. And part of that issue we've faced is, you know, we have an aim to have a community-led GP service. There are insufficient GPs in Hartlepool. But because people don't want to talk about it because it will threaten the power of the current GP, we can't get it off the ground, which allows everybody else to ignore the potential for doing it. And I think the saddest thing for me is, like, in a town like Hartlepool, it's so obviously demonstrated that our communities are ambitious for change. You know, they are not happy with the status quo. Their voting patterns over the last 10 years or so, you know, from going from an elected mayor for Hartlepool to voting for independence, to voting for the Brexit party. The referendum result was a vote for change. They want things to change. And, you know, we now have a Tory MP, and a majority of our local council, the largest party in our local council is Tory. And that isn't about, that's about a cry for help and a cry for change, because they are demanding it and they want it to happen. And no matter how much they do that, we are still left with the same institutional barriers, regardless of who's in power. And that's because nobody's mandated to actually look at the local level and say, actually, we are going to do this in a way which communities can be at the forefront of it. And for me, I think the Community Power Act puts it on a statutory footing, which will turn around and say, you have to work in a way which enables local people, local organisations who have a genuine stake in their place to be able to work with you and to do a better job than what we currently have done. Because actually, in a town where life expectancy is falling, and that was before COVID, what we currently have isn't acceptable and it's not good enough. And I think for me, a Community Power Act where we put the power back into the hands of communities to work alongside agencies and to demonstrate, actually using the word covenant, is actually we share many of the same values. And I think in all of this is like, by using a covenant rather than a compact, it's about a value-based approach. And I think that would be hugely important in the future.
Thank you very much indeed, Sacha. And I know already in the chat you're getting some responses to that. So I'm sure that we'll have some more questions and comments later. Can we now hear from Gina Braithwaite? Look forward to hearing what you have to say, Gina.
Thank you, Jill. So yeah, I'm Gina Braithwaite and I support the policy and public affairs work for the Community Wealth Fund campaign. So the Community Wealth Fund is a proposed independent endowment that would provide both the support and funding needed to rebuild social infrastructure in left behind neighbourhoods. Now, social infrastructure has a vital role to play in the levelling up of the country, as it creates institutions and spaces that foster personal relationships and increase civic engagement. And this all leads to more cohesive and prosperous communities. Left behind communities are doubly disadvantaged as they're both lacking in this form of infrastructure and they're also severely deprived. So as such, residents have markedly worse socioeconomic outcomes than those in other equally deprived areas. And this is across every key metric. So unemployment is higher, health is poorer, household income and educational attainment are also both lower. In addition to this, left behind neighbourhoods also often miss out on the funding that they need to tackle these issues. So recent research has found that they receive less than half of the amount of grant funding that's received in other equally deprived areas. And this is partly due to the fact that left behind neighbourhoods lack individuals and organisations such as charities with the knowledge and skills to apply for this funding. So recent research by the APPG for Left Behind Neighbourhoods has also found that there are almost 3 times fewer registered charities in Left Behind Neighbourhoods per 100,000 population than across England as a whole. So the Community Wealth Fund would overcome these problems by empowering local people and communities to develop their own responses to the issues they're facing. It would do so using the principles of long-term patient funding, investment at the hyperlocal level, and community-led decision-making. And these principles are tried and tested. We know they work because they're based on learning from previous government and charitable initiatives, including Local Trust's Big Local programme. This is the largest ever national experiment in neighbourhood level devolution. And outcomes from the programme so far include reduced social isolation, increased confidence, increased civic participation, and also greater access to employment opportunities. And this evidences the importance of social infrastructure in improving outcomes. And we would expect to see the same results with the CWF. So the campaign has strong support. We have over 490 organisations that are signed up to our alliance. And we're also backed by the APPG for Left Behind Neighbourhoods, which includes over 70 MPs. The money to fund the Community Wealth Fund campaign we're proposing should come from the expanded Dormant Assets scheme. And the Dormant Assets Bill has recently received royal assent, which makes the expansion of this scheme possible. During its progression through Parliament, we received support for our proposal from over 200 MPs. And we really want to continue the sort of momentum that we've built to really put power and resources in the hands of communities to enable them to level up their areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Gina. Well, we've received some very interesting and challenging ideas indeed about how we can put more power in the hands of communities. So we move now to our question and answer, which is always the core of these all-party group meetings. Now, as is customary, I will take MPs and peers first. Chris is going to let me know if any of them have got hands up and want to ask questions. But when you're asking your question or making your comment, could you also give some thought to what the all-party group, this APPG, could do in taking those ideas forward into the future? We've had some very interesting ones already from our speakers, of course. So Chris, can you tell me MPs or peers who are wanting to ask questions?
I can't see any hands up at the moment, but perhaps if someone wants to come forward. Oh yeah, Joe Gideon.
Okay, Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm the Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent Central and a massive supporter of the Community Power Act and the Community Wealth Fund. You know, mine is a left behind neighbourhood and would benefit really from all the proposals that are laid out. I think the challenge is that, and I've gone on record as saying this, that the funding of levelling up activities so far to a large extent has gone via local authorities. And I think some of the challenges that have been highlighted here are that you know, the one size fits all funnel for funding is not reaching, is not, I hate the term cascading down, but you know what I mean, that it's not actually reaching neighbourhood level and community level engagement. And so I think the mechanism for how government can distribute funds in a way that will get to the neighbourhood level effectively is key to solving these problems. Can I just say, I have to leave for PMQs. If we're going to have the AGM, that might need to happen, you know, in the next half hour.
No, can I just say we're not having the AGM, and I ought to have said that at the beginning, Joe, so don't worry, we'll have the AGM at a subsequent meeting. But thank you very much. And you mentioned that the mechanisms aren't working for getting the funding down. Perhaps we can ask our speakers if they've got any ideas for how we could get that in quotes cascade of money. And Sacha, I'll come to you first, because you talked about indeed the competition between the local authority and the groups.
Yeah, it's I think, I mean, we've got a history of doing area-based work in the past. This country, we've done it from, you know, single regeneration budgets, European funding. So there's historically been mechanisms for doing it. I think there's two things that, and I hate the term left behind, because I just think actually what we should be talking about was irrelevant places. We can actually, for lots of reasons, the people of these communities were irrelevant. But there's I think we have history and we have mechanisms. If you look at what Local Trust have done, is they've been able to give 150 places £1 million over 10 years, which is pretty well community-led funding. Now that's, you know, it's small beer compared with levelling up, but it shows there is a potential to do that type of work in a way which local people can lead and can take responsibility for. And as somebody who's worked in a big local area, they are really conscious about how they spend big local money. It's like it's their own, and so they're always like beg, steal and borrow and do it as cheaply as possible, which is terrific. But I think what we need to do is recognise the value of working at a neighbourhood level is the equivalent of what Ben Houch and T's value of buying an airport or doing the carbon capture stuff. And what we have is, I think we have a value which says the big stuff is vastly more important than the little stuff. But actually, if you want to create a bridge between the big stuff and the neighbourhoods who need it most, you have to channel the funding and resources, the responsibility, the accountability to enable people to feel part of that, so that they can be part of the bigger stuff. Because at the moment, if I knocked on the doors of 50 people within a mile of here, what's the airport mean to you? What have you benefited financially from the airport, or what are you benefiting from Tees Port? The answer is not a lot. And so we need to create the conditions where there's a bridge, so that stepping stone, that process to that. And it can come through things like shared prosperity, levelling up and so on. But we need to be explicit that the value of working at this level is as important as the value at the super local level. And that requires people to, and it's a value-based thing rather than a big shiny spend 200 million thing. Sounds better than spending 2 million, because it does, and it makes a better headline. But actually that £2 million might unlock the skills, talents, abilities and aspirations of people in a very local area.
Thank you. And Ed and Gina, I'll come to you both to see if you had any comments on this.
Sure, I'll jump. Yeah, totally agree with Joe's analysis. And I think what we find kind of frustrating, you know, particularly around some of the levelling up funding, is that there is money there. There's kind of money being spent, but local communities are kind of finding it very hard to access. So even things like the community ownership fund, which is very much kind of designed to support communities, because of in many ways the kind of centralised and competitive way that and the quite tight criteria around the funding, loads of really important projects that we know are out there have not been able to access it so far. I think the same goes for the the levelling up fund, the shared prosperity fund, which is going to be coming up. There are big opportunities here, but there's real challenges around how those funds are designed. So what we're proposing in the Community Power Act is that to create community covenants at a local level, so partnerships between local authorities and local communities at a very kind of neighbourhood level. And we think that these will become a kind of forum by which those funds can be genuinely devolved to communities. So communities are in charge of the important spending decisions which happen in the neighbourhoods. So if there was a vehicle through the Community Power Act for those funds to be really devolved to that neighbourhood level, then we think that'll be a really kind of important step forward, which would support the levelling up agenda.
Thank you very much. And Gina?
Thank you. I agree there is a real problem with accessibility of funds, especially in deprived areas, left behind areas. So as I said earlier, there is a real challenge around individuals, residents, and also organisations without the capacity to apply for funds. So that leaves these areas sort of deprived in terms of the funding that they need to tackle the issues that they have. Now, the Community Wealth Fund sort of bypasses this by actually injecting funding directly to residents. And I think also an important thing to touch on is the need to build social infrastructure to also understand what residents need in their communities. We need places where people can come together to discuss the issues that they're having and the solutions that would work for them. Without that, any funding that we're sort of getting through local authorities may not actually tackle the root issues. So I think that's another reason that we do need hyperlocal investment so that residents can build this social infrastructure and can also use the funding on the products that they deem worthy.
And the key thing is what is needed in their particular area for their particular community, not a one-size-fits-all, as I think somebody said. Now, sorry,
pardon me,
carry on,
just come
Joe.
back on
Yes,
that,
please do.
Just with one thing, because as Sacha said, you know, we have historically had the means to distribute funds to the local level. And he mentioned European funding. So the Shared Prosperity Fund obviously now replaces that. And so, you know, I've expressed concern that it's going to local authorities again, because actually, you know, I think part of this expression of concern has to be, if it's not ring fenced, you know, is there a significant risk that the things that it was originally spent on, it won't be spent on going forward. Yes. And that's my personal concern.
Yes, and I'm sure a concern of many of us, having seen the way non-ring fence local authority funding often goes. I can see Baroness Masham from the House of Lords has her hand up. So Sue, over to you.
My question is about Hartlepool, saying that there is a shortage of GPs. Should we not welcome more people in from across the world and who want to work here, and until we've trained more? But at the moment, there are more people who want to come and train as doctors in the UK, but there aren't enough places. So somebody must get their sums right.
Sacha, can you help us in Hartlepool with getting sums right?
I mean, our idea is that, I think firstly, if people want to come here and be GPs, notwithstanding it means that they're not a GP in their other country or wherever they're coming from. And so I think we have to look at, in terms of global equity, if we take the best talented people from around the world, it means that there is a gap that we leave behind. So that's a big question. In terms of Hartlepool, I know of at least 2 people who have died because they couldn't get access to a GP in the last 18 months. One of them was my colleague who sat next to me for 10 years. But there are alternative ways of providing provision, which at the moment nobody really takes a look at. So our ambition was that we've worked with Teesside University for probably 8 or 9 years, and we take occupational therapy students on placement. And so if you based your triage on occupation and you turn around, you come up with a problem, actually you might just need putting in like a creative art group run by a community business. If you're only really looking for a social opportunity, well, we've got a community-led cafe. If you're looking at, you know, if you need to lose a bit of weight, well, we'll have a community-led gym, so it's not all lycra bunnies. And actually, the profits that are made in that then get reinvested back into the community, as opposed to, and I don't begrudge GPs earning a profit, but the GPs themselves will take a profit share out of the money from, so they'll get a basic salary and then they'll take a profit share out of whatever the practice makes. I can't be a GP, but I can be a practice partner. But I think the more GPs we get who are doing GP work as opposed to all the other stuff before that. We can intercept that and allow a GP to really focus on the medical side of it and allow the social side of it to be done by other organisations who should actually be paid to do that. Pfizer don't do stuff for free, so why should our sector? And I think things like social prescribing do not recognise there is a cost to the places which offer that support.
And perhaps any colleagues who are in the meeting, if they've got any examples of GPs working with local community and voluntary sector to do some of the things that Sacha talks about, you know, as it were, the social prescribing, perhaps you could put those in the chat or make a comment about it. I see that Hilary Bloom has got her hand up. So Hilary, over to you.
Okay, I wanted to reply to Baroness Masham's suggestion. Given the situation in Ukraine, and we've seen a lot of students from developing countries are actually being trained there to be doctors. And, you know, the BBC has shown somebody who was, you know, done 6 years, and his final year he feels is thrown away. And we know that there's been discrimination at the borders. Why doesn't the UK suggest that we invite the Commonwealth students, or bigger than the Commonwealth, but let's say Commonwealth students, to come to the UK to finish their medical degrees? Some might stay, some might go back, but it seems absolutely on two grounds. One is that we're so shameful and being shown up as being very unwelcoming to people. And secondly, we need more doctors, and the world needs more doctors. And it's something we could do. And it's something that other countries might not be able to do, because so many of those students actually speak English. Okay.
Indeed, I'm not quite sure where to direct that suggestion, I must say, but it seems a sensible one to me. Has anybody else got anything to comment about that Hilary has just said? Evidently not.
Sorry about that.
Not at all. It seems a sensible suggestion, and that, you know, that might go through one of the Commonwealth organisations or something. But I think we do hear on the radio this morning that we are seeming to be pretty mean in our welcome compared with many other countries in Europe. Now, Chris, have we got any other hands up? If not, I'm going to ask for more comment on this issue of local authorities, because people are putting stuff in the chat about how local authorities work. And I wonder if anybody else has got any experience, as Sacha has set out to us, whereby the local authority, and we've seen this happen all the time, haven't we, in the voluntary sector? The voluntary sector starts a very good scheme, and then the local authority takes it up and perhaps wants then ownership of it. Has anybody else got any experience of that they would like to share in the meeting this morning? Hang on, I've got another. John Everett. Tell us what you're doing. Oh, no, this is back to GPs. John, can you say a bit more about what you're doing with GP practices?
Yes, certainly. I'm sorry if there's background noise. I'm sitting in Euston Station, which is why my screen is off. So we're actually partnering at the moment with a number of corporates who are landlords of GP practice centres. And we're running programs at the moment in Scotland and in Lincolnshire, pilot programs for PHP to actually do social prescribing programs around their GP practices. So in their local communities around all their GP practices. We're doing the same with Assura in Cheshire, and that also extends out to Northern England and into Wales as well, their GP practices. And then our CFs, our community foundations, regularly work locally with local authorities and with corporates on social prescribing programs in their areas. A successful one in the past has been Devon. So, you know, I can provide details of that if anyone needs that.
I think many people in the meeting would be very glad to have those details from you, John. And I think you're very valiant tuning into our meeting from Euston Station, but we heard you fine. So thanks very much. There's a very interesting comment from Amy Barnes about local authorities and the problems that they have, and which perhaps undermines their ability to participate in the way that we're suggesting we need them to participate. Do you want to say a bit more about that, Amy?
Yes, I can say a bit more. I suppose I'm working in Sheffield with the council and also voluntary sector partners. My focus is public health, but that often involves thinking about very many other things that are affecting and undermining people's health. And actually, voice and influence is fundamental to an understanding of health and well-being. And what we found over the last kind of 5 to 10 years is that increasingly, because local authorities are having to spend a lot of time and energy filling in kind of funding applications to apply for kind of projectized funding from the centre, whether that's for kind of transport funds, whether that's for other forms of local development, in which local people have very many different views and ideas. It means that they have less time and ability to engage in that kind of long-term systematic way, which can build people's capabilities, which can kind of value their voice and influence. And I think there are loads of different issues around why communities may or may not be kind of listened to at a local authority level, but certainly the way that local authorities interface with central government is, I think, part of the issue that we should be looking at.
Well, indeed, and very much looking at what the barriers are there. And Claire says that the local authorities duplicate good work instead of supporting and helping. Now, is that, do we think, through lack of ideas, or is it because they don't engage directly enough with the community? Perhaps I could ask you to start us off with that, Ed, from Locality. Is it because the local authorities are too busy applying with their own funding? Is it that they don't trust the local community sector enough? What are the reasons behind that, do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on, and I guess I should start by saying I think there are increasing examples of good local authority kind of practice as well. At Locality, we've been building up a network of Keep It Local councils who are kind of really committed to a partnership way of working, and it feels like there's kind of growing momentum behind that approach. But obviously, kind of it's very patchy across the country, and certainly kind of recognise all the kind of negatives that people are saying. I guess that's kind of partly, the conditions around spending and pressure on local authority budgets and capacity do make things incredibly difficult. I mean, we find when we're working with councils that just finding the capacity to do something differently and kind of think about the long term is really hard when there's all this kind of firefighting going on, or you're applying for new kind of competitive funds from government to be able to do anything. So there are a lot of pressures on local authorities, but then also I think there is a big kind of cultural challenge around control and kind of not wanting to let go, and often a kind of lack of understanding and trust of local community organisations. I think that is something that we've seen shifting over the experience of the pandemic, because of that kind of fantastic local community response that has been so important in coordinating services and actually kind of stepping up kind of often faster and more effectively than the local public sector response. We certainly hear about growing local authority, understanding of the work of community organisations, respect for it, and kind of wanting to work more in Parliament. So again, I guess that's part of why we think now's the moment for a big shift around this Community Power Act. And actually, as well as kind of creating the rights and powers that we think a piece of legislation would do, we also think it would send a really important signal to local authorities that this is the way of kind of that we're doing things now, and that kind of working in partnership with with local communities, supporting the capacity and skills and power that exists in communities as the most effective way of achieving your solutions right now. We think legislation would send a powerful signal.
Well, it's interesting the point that you make, and several people have made the point about trust. But it's interesting that you say that has been very much aided by what happened in the pandemic, because local authorities were often much slower to react, as indeed health bodies were than local community groups. I mean, do people feel that trust has been increased because of our experience in the pandemic? I'm talking trust between statutory authorities and the local community sector. What are people's views about that? Anyone going to offer an opinion on that? Because somebody says that we haven't got sufficient governance structures down to what I gather we're calling hyper-local levels. But what about parish councils, for example, in country areas? John Paul has got his hand up there. Please, you're muted, John. Could you take yourself off mute?
So sorry. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I think trust is a big issue, but I also think they're having to engage with local communities more because of over-reliance. So the more cuts in services we see, the more the voluntary sector and local sector step up and into them gaps. But I do believe also that everyone's evidenced so brilliantly today that it's really difficult to support local communities with the the barriers to participation, insurances, risk assessments, fear. There's a real fear from local authority, I think, in terms of trusting community to get on and lead in these areas. I do believe exactly what you've said today and evidence today, that the funding streams and support from a central level would really help local communities then have the autonomy to really lead on all sector issues. And it's been fascinating to listen to you today. I echo everything that you've said. I work for an MP, but leading in a volunteer sector. And just to touch on, in terms of replication from local authority of what the volunteer sector is doing, is, as said, there's a multiple layers of issues there, but a lot of it is also people are paid to deliver something and they see people unpaid doing it, and they feel like they have to justify the jobs rather than promote people in the true sense. So I think we need leaders, community leaders, but also in the paid sector and local authority to actually embrace people who are making a difference as well. I think that's very important.
Thank you very much, John Paul. Claire has got her hand up, and then I'll come to Jill after that.
Hi. Yes, I was going to say, during the pandemic, obviously the local authorities were forced to work with mutual aid groups and vice versa, and there was a lot of organic groups coming together, and the learning has started to happen slowly. But the problem is that the local authority is so big and there's so many different departments and they don't talk to each other, and so the learning is quite slow, and the people move around so often in the local authorities. It's quite difficult for them to pass on that experience in some cases, I think.
And in some cases, one does hear about local authority staff being very demoralized, and therefore they're not, in a sort of position to lift their heads up and see some other way of tackling a problem. Jill, is that how you pronounce it, Jill?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
It is. Thank you. I would also like to say that but often the voices which are not heard, it's not through lack of interest or lack of will to be part of the conversation. But I'm autistic and I have good communication skills. However, there are many autistic people and people with neurological conditions who don't have a voice, and carers often are unable to meet at meetings to speak out but that doesn't mean to say that they don't have values and interests, and they don't want to speak out, but they usually trust local community groups or voluntary organisations where they perhaps have support. So the voluntary organisations know what these people think, and they are far more likely to be able to give a broad brush of lived experience. And that is, I feel, a really, really, really important part, where often when you're talking about groups meeting at the local community or the council or parish councils, it's only those people who have the will to speak in public, or who feel that they have the time and the effort, and that's not necessarily the people who really need the help most. If that makes any sense at all, I hope it does.
That's right, and that's where I think the previous comment about community leadership and people who can do that. But one of my experiences in a long career working with the voluntary sector is, and particularly about finding out what local communities need, is that local authorities and indeed health agencies are always frightened about what is going to be asked for, you know, that it's going to be much more than they can ever cope with. And the reality is so much contrary to that, I think, in that it's not that they want more services, it's just they want the right services that are for them. Do other people share that experience? And if so, how does the community sector, how does indeed this all-party group try to get that message over? You know, that don't be frightened of engaging, because it's not going to be as scary as you fear. Well, perhaps I'll come to one of our speakers. Or what's your view about that, Gina? About the lack of the fear that the agencies have about reaching out to communities.
I feel like it comes with, as Ed was saying earlier, a culture shift. And part of that comes with experience. So the big local program that I mentioned earlier that's being administered by Local Trust, we've had experiences with big local areas that have found it difficult to engage with local authorities, where local authorities are very apprehensive about what might be asked of them, or about engaging in certain projects with them. But that is shifting, and I think a big part of that is seeing that community groups and community leaders can successfully lead projects. They can deliver outcomes that need to be delivered, and sometimes it does take a bit of time to do that. But I feel like when we give communities more power as well, then it also forces local authorities to engage and to listen to them, because they do have the power to also make changes with or without them.
Yes, can I come back to you, Jill? Have you still got your hand up, or no? Okay. Can I come back to Ed to say a little more about the Community Power Act, and what's your expectation on timing of it? We're expecting a Queen's speech, for example, in May. Are you hoping for something to be announced at that point, or indeed any of the MPs still on the call might give us a lead on that, though I suspect many of them will have gone into the Commons chamber by now. But Ed, could you tell us a bit more about what you hope for in a bill?
Yes, sure. So, I mean, we're at the kind of early stages of the campaign. So, I mean, we'd obviously love to see it in the next Queen's speech, but that kind of might be a bit soon for us potentially. But we'll see where we get to. I mean, in terms of the specifics around it, we've kind of got three main proposals as part of the Act. The first bit is about creating some new community rights for local people. So very much kind of building on, expanding the community rights that were created by the Localism Act about a decade ago, but kind of learning from, I guess, some of the ways those haven't been as effective as they should have been, and kind of growing from there. So we've got some new powerful rights that communities can exercise. And then the second part of it is about this thing I've mentioned around creating community covenants at the local level. So these would be kind of power sharing agreements between between local authorities and a local neighbourhood. So that at the neighbourhood level, that might be with a parish council if one exists, or it might be with a neighbourhood forum, which has been kind of created through neighbourhood planning that could take on more powers, or it could be existing community organisations or alliances of community organisations. But really kind of what we're proposing is that once this community covenant gets formed and kind of ratified, then that kind of neighbourhood level governance institution would be able to draw down a range of different powers and resources to support those powers. So whether that's around, you know, local spending, kind of informing local economic plans, kind of community asset transfer, how services are provided in the local neighbourhood, there'd be a real mechanism for local communities to have much more control and power over the important things that happen in their neighbourhood. So that's the kind of big institutional shift that we're looking to create. And then the third thing would be about creating a community power commissioner in Whitehall. So the role of this would be about, you know, holding Whitehall's and government's feet to the fire on the Community Power Act, making sure that all departments were starting to think and embed community power in how they deliver policy, but also to have oversight over the community covenants and the whole thing to make sure that they were, while that, you know, is going to, each one of those will reflect you know, local circumstance and build on that, but the Community Power Commissioner will have the kind of oversight to make sure that there's certain common principles that are being adhered to.
And what political support have you got so far?
So we have got, we're in the early stages of the campaign, so we've got, we're discussing having some parliamentary champions on, you know, both in the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. So I believe, so Joe Gideon, who was on the call, is yes, one of our supporters.
You mentioned that, yes.
So we're building some supportive voices in Parliament at the moment. So we'd obviously kind of love to work with the APPG kind of on that, and yeah, if people are interested, have some more detailed conversations about how parliamentarians can support the campaign.
Well, we'd certainly be very interested to hear the progress of that, and I'm sure the APPG would be very pleased to work with you on how that progresses, understanding that you're at the beginning of that. But at the same time, because the levelling up agenda is going ahead, we don't want to miss a boat, do we, about that? So we need to feed that into the whole levelling up agenda and legislation, presumably.
Yes, and if I could just say one more, I think actually the Levelling Up white paper offers some really kind of positive progress on this. So in the communities kind of section of that paper, which I think has quite a lot of, they're quite early stage ideas, but they're exactly the right type of ideas that need to be developed, and that does commit to piloting community covenants.
Yes.
So there's a really good opportunity to embed some of the principles that we're talking about that could then inform an act.
Yes, and any campaign, you've got to be prepared to use whatever opportunity presents itself, haven't you? Even if we can't actually see them at the moment, there might be some coming up as we go along. Now, has anybody else got any questions or comments that they'd like to have made? Because, yes, Gail, would you like to come in now?
Hi, yes, thank you. So I put a comment in the chat earlier about the money management of local smaller organisations, but I would really like to highlight the issues around community and charity banking. So one example, my local speakers club have had their bank account frozen due to COVID inactivity, 10 weeks to reopen it again. Gosh. Why? Can we talk about the fact that if you've got cash, even if you live in a big town, you might be asked to drive 20 or 30 miles to bank those coins. The months and months it takes to change a signatory on an account, and that's even assuming that the bank is willing to take you on. I hear about community organisations all the time where they're just told, sorry, no, we're not taking on any charity bank accounts at the moment. The charges that get applied on very, very low level, low use accounts are often excessive. They probably shouldn't be being applied in the first place, but that support just isn't there for the charity organisations. And as a trustee of a very high income organisation, I'd really like somewhere where we can put our charity reserves that's actually very, very ethical, because we all know that the mainstream banks, what they're investing in might not actually fit our ideals.
Well, thank you very much. And I think that's a very interesting point, because it's one I hear all the time, sort of in my local village hall. You know, what are we going to do with this cash that we've collected for the breakfast that we've served this week, and so on. And maybe, Chris, something that the all-party group could take up at a point in the future. Now, I'm going to have to bring the meeting to a close, but I just will go to our three speakers very, very briefly, if they would like to leave us with one lasting thought. And that's, I'll come back to you first, Sacha, very briefly, if you would.
If you want to help people find their voice and execute it and be meaningful and put it on the statutory fund and join the campaign.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Gina?
If you want to give communities more power and see the amazing things that residents can do, then please support the Community Wealth Fund campaign in the upcoming Dormant Assets consultation.
Thank you. And last word to you, Ed.
Thanks. Well, I mean, I just feel like for all the things we're talking about, this could be a kind of really significant moment, you know, coming out of the experience of COVID and with the levelling up agenda. So feels like now is the time, but also that it won't necessarily be unless we kind of push for it and fight for it and put the right proposals together and all come together. So yes, just a call to seize this moment if we possibly can.
Seize the day, a nice thing on which to end. I'd like to thank all of you for attending, and most particularly our thanks to the speakers, and especially, of course, to NCVO for organising. Now, we have got more meetings planned, and it will be our hope that certainly by May we will be able to meet in person and actually look each other in the eye, in the flesh, as it were. We'll keep you posted about that. And meantime, we've had some very, very helpful suggestions in the chat, and a lot of ability to liaise with each other and share information with each other, which is part of the point of these meetings. So may I thank you again very much, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you. Will you close, Chris? Yes, thank you.